I knew the HOA had a vendetta against me, but I never thought they'd go after my kids. It all started when my wife and I decided to build a small wooden playhouse in our backyard for our 2 kids. Nothing fancy, just a little structure with a slide and a few swings. We built it ourselves on a weekend and my kids were ecstatic. They spent every afternoon in that playhouse, laughing and playing with the neighborhood kids. It was their little world. Then came Karen Whitmore. Karen was the HOA president and she treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. A middle-aged woman with a permanent scowl, she lived in the biggest house on the block, a modern monstrosity with marble pillars and an iron gate. And she hated anything that didn't fit her vision of perfection. She showed up at my doorstep 3 days after we finished the playhouse, holding a clipboard like she was about to issue a citation. "This eyesore has to go," she said, not even bothering with pleasantries. I crossed my arms. "It's in my backyard, Karen. HOA rules don't apply here." She scoffed. "It's visible from the street, which means it's a violation. You'll need to remove it immediately." I wasn't stupid. I had read the HOA bylaws front to back before we moved in. Nowhere did it say anything about backyard structures being an issue. "Not happening," I said. Karen's lips pressed together so tightly they almost disappeared. "I'll be back with an official notice." And she was. The next day, she taped a violation letter to my door demanding the removal of the playhouse within 72 hours or face fines. I ignored it. I wasn't about to let a power-hungry HOA president dictate what my kids could have in their own backyard. Then, one evening, I came home from work to find my kids crying in the backyard. My wife, Camille, was furious. "They destroyed it," she said, pointing at the wreckage of the playhouse. I felt my blood turn to ice. Karen had sent a crew to tear it down. The wood was smashed, the slide was broken in half, and the swings were gone. My daughter, barely 6, held a piece of the shattered wood in her tiny hands like a lost treasure. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. "She did this." Camille nodded. She said it was unauthorized and that the HOA had the right to remove it. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my rage in check. She wants to play dirty? Fine. She just made the biggest mistake of her life. I wasn't going to let Karen win. No, I was going to make sure she regretted ever touching my kids' playhouse. And I knew exactly how to do it. I stood in my backyard, staring at the remains of my kids' playhouse. The destruction wasn't just an attack on a structure, it was a message. Karen wanted to remind everyone that she had the power to control the neighborhood. She thought she could intimidate me into submission. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I spent that night gathering every HOA bylaw, every city ordinance, and every legal document I could find. I wasn't just going to fight her, I was going to dismantle her authority piece by piece. The first step was proving that her actions were illegal. I contacted an attorney, a friend from college who specialized in property disputes. After listening to everything, he laughed. "She trespassed and destroyed private property. This is an easy lawsuit," he said. "But you don't just want to sue her, do you?" I shook my head. "I want to make an example out of her." He leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "Tell me what you have in mind." The next morning, I filed a police report for destruction of property and trespassing. I made sure copies of the report landed in the hands of every homeowner in our HOA. Karen had ruled by fear, but fear only worked when people felt powerless. When they saw that someone was willing to fight back, they started whispering about their own grievances. Next, I dug into the HOA's finances. Karen had been running the association for years, and I had always suspected she wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was profiting from them. With the help of a few neighbors, I got access to the HOA's budget reports. What I found was exactly what I expected. Misuse of funds, unexplained expenses, and payments made to contractors that didn't exist. I compiled everything into a neat little folder and brought it to the next HOA meeting. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a space Karen loved to use as her personal courtroom. She sat at the head of the long table, her usual smug confidence radiating from her like a storm cloud. The other board members sat beside her, some loyal, others clearly nervous. I waited until the meeting was almost over before standing. I placed the folder on the table in front of her. "This is a record of your financial misconduct," I said. "And this," I pulled out another document, "is proof that you illegally ordered the destruction of my property." Karen's face darkened. "You have no authority to accuse me of anything." I smiled, calm and unwavering. "Actually, I do. Because I'm officially filing a motion to remove you as HOA president. The room erupted. Homeowners who had been too afraid to speak out before suddenly had the courage to voice their own complaints. Late fees they were never notified about, fines for violations that didn't exist, and the favoritism Karen had shown to her friends, all of it spilled out into the open. Karen tried to regain control, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted. By the end of the meeting, a vote was called. The majority ruled in favor of removing her from her position. She stormed out furious but powerless. But I wasn't done. With Karen gone, I proposed a new use for the HOA funds, the creation of a massive community playground. And where better to build it than on the property that Karen had once used to flaunt her power? It took months of legal maneuvering, but eventually the city intervened. An audit revealed that Karen's mansion had been built with funds siphoned from the HOA. The penalties were severe, and in the end, she was forced to sell. The neighborhood pulled together, and with the approval of the city, Karen's former estate was transformed into something she would have despised: a public playground, open to all families in the community. The day it opened, my kids were the first to run through the gates. They laughed as they climbed the jungle gym, slid down the slides, and swung on the swings. And as I watched them, I knew one thing for certain: Karen would never control this neighborhood again. With Karen out of the picture, the neighborhood finally had a chance to breathe. The HOA board, once under her iron grip, was scrambling to reorganize. Without her constant interference, decisions were being made fairly, and for the first time, homeowners actually had a say in how things were run. But I wasn't finished. Karen had spent years exploiting the system, and I had no doubt there were still layers of corruption left to uncover. I began working with a few neighbors who had access to old HOA records, digging through years of financial statements, complaints, and contracts. What we found was worse than any of us had imagined. Karen had been funneling HOA funds into personal expenses for years. Lavish vacations were disguised as community outreach programs. Luxury renovations on her home were listed as neighborhood maintenance projects. Worst of all, she had been fining homeowners for minor infractions and pocketing a significant portion of those fees. Armed with this evidence, I took the next step. I contacted the city's housing authority and provided them with everything we had uncovered. It didn't take long for them to launch an official investigation. Within weeks, investigators were combing through the HOA's financial records, and the more they found, the worse it got. Meanwhile, Karen was nowhere to be found. After her removal from the board, she had retreated into her mansion, avoiding the neighbors she had once ruled over. That changed when city officials arrived on her doorstep. When they finished their audit, the penalties were swift and severe. Not only was she forced to repay a significant amount of the stolen funds, but she also faced fraud charges. The fallout was immediate. The house she had used to flaunt her status was seized to cover some of her debts. It sat empty for months, a symbol of her downfall. That's when an idea started forming. The land Karen's house sat on was one of the largest plots in the neighborhood. Instead of letting it sit abandoned, I proposed something radical: turning it into a public space for the community. The idea gained traction quickly. Parents who had dealt with Karen's ridiculous rules were eager to support something that would finally benefit the residents. The legal process was complicated, but with the HOA under new leadership, we managed to navigate the red tape. The city approved the project, and soon demolition crews arrived to tear down what was left of Karen's ill-gotten empire. The transformation was incredible. What was once a symbol of greed and corruption became a vibrant community park. The playground was designed with input from families, ensuring that it had everything the neighborhood kids needed: a massive jungle gym, slides, swings, and even a picnic area. Watching the first wave of children run through the park on opening day was the most satisfying moment of all. My kids, who had cried over their destroyed playhouse, now had something even greater. They played alongside their friends, their laughter filling the air. Karen had spent years controlling this neighborhood through fear and manipulation. Now, her legacy had been reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale, while the community she had tried to dominate had come together, stronger than ever. With the park officially open, the neighborhood had undergone a transformation. For the first time in years, people actually enjoyed living here. Kids played freely, families spent weekends together, and the oppressive atmosphere that Karen had enforced was gone. But I knew there was still unfinished business. Karen had vanished from public view after losing her position and her house. But she hadn't disappeared completely. Some of the neighbors had seen her skulking around town, bouncing between motels and cheap rentals. She had gone from the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood to a disgraced former tyrant with nowhere to go. I wasn't interested in petty revenge, but I did want to make sure she never had the chance to manipulate another HOA again. That meant ensuring that her misconduct followed her. I made a few calls, reaching out to contacts in local government and real estate. Karen had a history, and I was willing to bet this wasn't the first time she had abused her power. Sure enough, after some digging, I uncovered records from her past previous neighborhoods where she had served on HOA boards, always leaving under suspicious circumstances. She had a pattern. Take control, exploit the system, then move on before the consequences caught up with her. This time, there would be no escape. I gathered the evidence and submitted it to the state's Housing Commission. Unlike a local issue that could be swept under the rug, this would go on record at a higher level. Not only would she face further legal scrutiny, but she would also be barred from ever holding an HOA position again. Meanwhile, the new HOA board had been working hard to undo the damage Karen had caused. With fresh leadership, the rules were revised to make them fair and reasonable. The excessive fines were eliminated, and the pointless regulations that Karen had enforced just to control people were rewritten or removed entirely. One of the most satisfying moments came when the board held a public meeting to announce the finalization of the new policies. Homeowners who had lived under Karen's rule for years finally had the chance to voice their concerns and their relief. The highlight of the evening, however, was when the board revealed the official renaming of the park. Instead of just calling it a community playground, they had decided to name it after the people who had stood up to Karen's tyranny. They unveiled the sign, Whitmore Community Park, named after my family. I hadn't expected it, and for a moment, I was at a loss for words. After everything we had been through, the destruction of my kids' playhouse, the battle against the HOA's corruption, the long fight to reclaim the neighborhood, this was more than I ever imagined. Camille squeezed my hand as applause filled the room. Our kids beamed with pride. Karen had tried to rule through fear, but in the end, the community had come together stronger than ever. And now, her legacy was nothing more than a distant memory, while ours would stand for generations to come. With the park thriving and the HOA finally in responsible hands, life in the neighborhood had never been better. Families who once kept their heads down now participated in community events, and the tension that had loomed over everyone for years had disappeared. The transformation was undeniable. But I wasn't naive. I knew people like Karen didn't just fade quietly into the background. She had built her life on control, and losing it all wasn't something she would accept easily. Sure enough, it wasn't long before I heard whispers that she was planning something. A few neighbors had spotted her lingering near the park in the early mornings, watching from a distance. Some said she had been talking to a few of her former allies, the ones who had benefited from her corrupt leadership. Whatever she was up to, I wasn't about to let her undo everything we had fought for. Then, one afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. The return address was from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal notice Karen was suing me. The claim: she accused me of orchestrating a personal vendetta against her, leading to emotional distress and loss of property value. According to her, everything I had done, from exposing her corruption to advocating for the park, had been a deliberate attack designed to ruin her life. I laughed when I read it. The irony was incredible. After all the destruction she had caused, she was now playing the victim. But legally, I couldn't just ignore it. She was hoping to drag me into a lengthy legal battle, likely thinking I'd back down to avoid the hassle. Instead, I called my attorney. He reviewed the lawsuit and shook his head. It was weak, built on vague accusations with no real evidence to support them. But it wasn't about winning. Karen was using the legal system as a weapon, trying to intimidate me into submission. That wasn't going to happen. Rather than just fighting the lawsuit, I decided to turn it into an opportunity. Karen had spent years manipulating people, but this time she had walked into a battle she couldn't control. I contacted some of the homeowners who had suffered the most under her rule, gathering testimonies about the fines, the intimidation, and the financial exploitation. Then I took things a step further. With the help of the new HOA board, I worked with a local journalist who had shown interest in covering the changes in our neighborhood. When I told him about Karen's lawsuit, he was immediately intrigued. He saw the bigger picture: a former HOA tyrant exposed for corruption, now trying to sue the very people who had freed the neighborhood from her grip. It was the kind of story that resonated with a lot of homeowners who had dealt with similar HOA abuses. A week later, an article was published detailing Karen's history of misconduct, the legal battle she had lost, and her desperate attempt to retaliate through baseless litigation. Accompanying the article was a collection of statements from residents who had suffered under her rule, painting a picture of a woman who had built her power on fear and manipulation. The response was explosive. The article spread beyond our neighborhood, reaching other communities and even legal experts who specialized in HOA abuses. The pressure mounted fast. Karen's lawsuit, which was supposed to intimidate me, backfired spectacularly. Instead of making me look like the villain, it only reinforced the fact that she had been the problem all along. Her lawyer withdrew from the case after realizing it was unwinnable, leaving her scrambling for representation. Meanwhile, the backlash from the public scrutiny was relentless. Landlords in the area refused to rent to her, knowing her reputation. Job opportunities evaporated as businesses didn't want to be associated with someone exposed for fraud. And then the final blow came. The State Housing Commission, already investigating her due to the financial misconduct we had uncovered earlier, accelerated their case against her. The evidence of embezzlement and fraudulent fines was overwhelming. She wasn't just facing civil penalties anymore; criminal charges were now on the table. By the time her lawsuit was officially dismissed in court, Karen had lost everything. Her financial accounts were frozen pending legal action, and without a home, she was forced to leave town entirely. No one knew exactly where she went, and frankly, no one cared. The neighborhood she had once terrorized had moved on without her, stronger than ever. As for me, I returned to my life, knowing that the battle was finally over. My kids played in the park that had once been her fortress, laughing with their friends, completely unaware of the storm that had passed. Karen had tried to destroy something that brought my children joy, thinking she could control everyone with fear. But in the end, all she had done was ensure that her legacy would be erased, while the community she tried to break had built something lasting in her absence. The neighborhood had changed for the better, but I wasn't naive enough to believe that everything was settled. Karen had been removed, her lawsuit had crumbled, and her misdeeds had finally caught up to her, but the damage she had done still left lasting ripples. People were finally free from her reign, but the scars of her control took time to heal. Some homeowners were still cautious, reluctant to trust that the HOA had truly changed. Others were eager to move forward but nervous that someone else could rise up and try to pull the same stunts Karen had. The fear of another tyrant taking over lingered even with the new leadership in place. I had no intention of letting that happen. With the new HOA board eager to rebuild trust, I proposed something that had never been done before: a full transparency policy. It wasn't enough to just have ethical leadership; people needed to see the inner workings of the HOA so that no one could ever manipulate the system again. The board agreed. We set up a public ledger that tracked every dollar spent, ensuring that every homeowner had access to the financials. Any proposed rule change now required a community vote, and meetings were recorded and archived for anyone to review. The days of secret fines and unilateral decisions were over. But even with these safeguards in place, something still felt unfinished. One evening, as I walked through the park that had once been Karen's estate, I realized what it was. The neighborhood had pushed forward, but my kids had never really gotten closure. They had watched their playhouse get demolished. They had seen the fight unfold, but they had never had a chance to reclaim what was taken from them in a way that truly mattered. That's when an idea struck me. I called together a few of the neighbors who had helped with the park project and pitched them a final addition to the space. A new playhouse not just for my kids, but for every child in the neighborhood. Something bigger, something better, something that would stand as a permanent reminder that the community had won. The response was immediate. Parents who had been skeptical about the HOA before were eager to contribute. Carpenters in the neighborhood volunteered their time. Donations poured in from residents who wanted to be part of something meaningful. Within weeks, we had enough materials and support to start building. The construction turned into a community event. Families showed up with tools, kids ran around excitedly, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt truly united. The playhouse itself became more than just a structure; it became a symbol. When it was finally completed, we held a small opening ceremony. Camille stood beside me as we watched our children run through the finished playhouse, their laughter ringing through the air. The other kids followed, climbing, swinging, sliding, all in a space that had once been ruled by a woman who had tried to control everything. As I looked around, I saw what we had built: not just a playhouse, not just a park, but a community that had learned to stand together. Karen had thought she could break us, but all she had done was bring us closer. With the sun setting behind the playground, I finally felt it. Closure.